It was the sound that first unsettled me. Not a scream, not a crash, but a slow, deliberate knocking. 3 knocks, each followed by an unnerving silence. I was alone, miles from any neighbor, nestled in a cottage that had been untouched for years. The wind outside howled like a wailing ghost, but the knocking persisted, louder now, almost like a rhythm. At first, I thought it was the wind, perhaps a branch tapping against the window. But no, this was different. These were distinct knocks, the kind you couldn't ignore. I stood frozen by the door, not sure whether to answer or retreat. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I lived alone. The nearest town was hours away, and even if someone did stumble across my cottage, who would be out here at this hour? I felt my pulse quicken, each beat louder than the last. I tried to steady myself, my hand hovering over the door's handle, but a strange unease held me still. Another knock, this time softer, as if it were testing my resolve. Then, silence again. I could feel the cold creeping in, not from outside, but from within, deep in my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my breath came out in shallow, quick gasps. The knocking hadn't stopped. It had been there all along, just waiting for me to acknowledge it. I glanced through the small window beside the door, but all I saw was the thick mist that had settled around the cottage. The darkness beyond it was all-consuming, like a void that refused to let go. I pulled my sweater tighter, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. The silence now felt heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't know what that something was, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something was wrong. My hand finally gripped the doorknob, and with one slow turn, I opened the door. Nothing. Just the fog, thick and dense, swallowing the space in front of me. Yet the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Mind. The cold air wrapped itself around me as I stepped cautiously out onto the porch, the mist clinging to my skin like a second layer. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in from every side. The knocking had stopped, but the unease lingered, thick and suffocating. My eyes scanned the yard, the dark shapes of trees lining the edge of the property. Nothing moved, no signs of life. It was as if the world had simply paused, holding its breath along with me. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place did little to ease the growing knot in my stomach. I'd been living here for months, in this remote cottage far from the chaos of the world. It had been my escape, away from the noise of the city, away from the things I was trying to forget. But now, that peace was slipping away, replaced by something darker. Something I didn't understand. My name is Ava, and I'd been trying to heal here. My therapist had recommended it after a rough year, a year I didn't like to think about too much. But here, in this lonely cottage, surrounded by the vast, empty woods, I was supposed to find peace. Instead, I found myself growing increasingly aware of the loneliness that pressed in around me at night, of the way the silence became suffocating when the world around me was still. The cottage was charming in its own way, with creaking floorboards and a worn fireplace that seemed to whisper secrets in the stillness. It wasn't much, just a small 2-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and windows that rattled with every gust of wind, but it had felt like the perfect place to disappear. But now the cottage felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. I moved into the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaking of the wood as the house settled. There was a single lamp on in the corner, casting a dim, flickering light. I ran my fingers over the cool edge of the counter, my thoughts drifting back to the earlier events. The knocking. The strange unease that had taken root in my chest. I had tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just my imagination, but something didn't sit right. As I turned toward the window, I caught a glimpse of movement in the yard, just a flicker, a shadow moving between the trees. I froze, staring out into the fog. Nothing. It was gone. I exhaled, my breath shaky. I was starting to wonder if I had made a mistake coming here. Was I running from something? Or was I running toward something I wasn't prepared for? The night settled around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to distract myself with the mundane. Making tea, checking my phone, flipping through an old book. But the feeling never left. It clung to me, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Suddenly, I heard it again, faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But no, this was something different. It was too clear, too deliberate. Ava. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, my eyes darting around the room. The whisper had come from the hallway, the place where the house was darkest. I tried to dismiss it. Surely it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the sound had been too real. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, my feet moved before my mind could catch up, carrying me toward the hallway. My breath quickened as I reached the door to the spare bedroom, where the whisper had seemed to come from. I pushed open the door, half expecting to find something waiting in the shadows. Nothing. The room was empty, bathed in the soft, dull glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. A thin layer of dust coated the floor, and a moth fluttered by the window, its delicate wings beating against the glass. I closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of the air pressing in around me again. But then, as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The whisper had been too distinct, too real. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. I wasn't alone. I turned back toward the kitchen, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. But the cold air seemed to have followed me. It was colder now, much colder than before, like a draft running along the floorboards. I knew I should have gone to bed, tried to sleep off whatever this feeling was. But sleep didn't come easily here, not anymore. Instead, I stood in the middle of the room, trying to gather my thoughts. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each second growing more and more oppressive. Then came the sound again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate knocks on the door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze. This time, I didn't move. I couldn't. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were leaning in closer. The knock came again, louder this time. It was followed by a deep, rasping breath. A sound that wasn't human. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. But there was one thing I knew for sure. The knocking wasn't just some trick of the wind. Something, or someone, was waiting for me at that door. The knocking didn't stop. Each tap on the door sent a jolt of cold fear racing through my veins. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow and quick. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of how long I had been standing here, paralyzed. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Then, the whisper again, closer this time. Ava. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The voice was softer than before, but it had an edge to it now. A hint of malice, a hint of something ancient that I didn't want to understand. I took a slow, steadying breath. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to leave, but my body refused. I knew I needed to get out of here. I had to. But where could I go? The nearest town was miles away, and in my state, I wouldn't make it past the woods. The knock came again. 3 times. My pulse thrummed in my ears. My legs shook as I took a cautious step forward. The door, still closed, still sealed, was the only thing between me and whatever waited outside. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was on the other side. But I couldn't just stand here either. I glanced toward the window by the door. The fog outside had thickened even more, blanketing everything in a dense, suffocating veil. Through the glass, I saw nothing. No movement, no shape, just a soft, gray blur. Another knock. This time, it wasn't followed by a whisper. Just silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud, heavy and oppressive. My mind screamed again to leave, to do something, anything, but I was rooted in place. I felt the weight of the door, the weight of the house pressing down on me, as though it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a choice. With a shaky hand, I reached for the doorknob. It was cold against my palm, colder than it should have been. I hesitated, then turned it. The door opened slowly, the creaking sound too loud in the stillness. Outside, there was nothing. No one. Just the thick fog, swallowing the yard, the trees, and everything beyond. I stood in the doorway, my body trembling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or not seeing. The air smelled of damp earth, but beneath it, there was something else, something metallic. Something that didn't belong. The fog pressed in close, and I felt the temperature drop even further, a sharp chill that sunk deep into my bones. I stood there for a moment, straining my eyes to see anything beyond the mist. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, and I spun around, heart racing. Nothing. The night had swallowed the world whole, leaving only an endless, gray expanse. Then, as if in response, a voice, a whisper, came from the yard, from the trees. Ava. I whipped my head back toward the source of the voice, but again, there was only fog. Only shadows. And in that moment, I knew. I knew something had been here, something was still here, and it wasn't going to stop. I slammed the door shut, the force of it rattling the walls. My pulse was pounding in my ears now, and my hands shook violently. I backed away from the door, breathing hard. But the feeling of being watched, didn't go away. It settled over me like a weight. The whispering continued, barely audible but unmistakable. Ava. We've been waiting. The words curled around me, sinking deep into my chest. I turned and fled from the living room, desperate for any escape from the suffocating atmosphere that pressed in on me from every direction. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent. The house was too quiet now. Too still. I reached the kitchen, then the back door. The lock was old, rusted. My hands fumbled as I tried to turn it, my breathing coming in sharp gasps. Finally, it gave way, and I yanked the door open. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The fog was even thicker here, swirling in the yard, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. I stepped outside, my feet crunching on the frozen ground. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn back, to go inside where it was safe. But the house, the cottage, didn't feel safe anymore. I had to get out. I walked, or stumbled, through the yard, my mind racing. The path ahead was shrouded in fog, the trees towering over me like dark sentinels. The world had narrowed to this. Just the muffled crunch of my feet in the grass, the suffocating fog, and the whispers, still faint, still distant, but never fully gone. Ava. The voice was closer now, behind me. No longer a whisper, but a rasping breath. It was like a shadow, slipping between the trees, following me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming faster. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the fog. A shape, half seen, standing just ahead of me. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to approach. Ava. The voice was unmistakable now, clear and urgent. It came from the figure. A man. No, not a man. There was something off about him, something wrong. His face was too pale, his eyes too dark. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, and his body seemed to sway with the fog, as though he was part of it. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, too loud, too fast. Come closer, the figure whispered, his voice a rasp, a low, hungry sound. We've been waiting for you. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. The air itself was thick with it. I could feel it pressing in on me, the fog curling around me like fingers. The world tilted, as if reality itself was bending. And all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by something more powerful than fear. Then, without warning, the figure lunged toward me. I didn't have time to think. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, bolting forward into the thick, suffocating fog. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, like it wasn't real, as if I were running through a dream, or worse, a nightmare. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The figure was still behind me, its footsteps too close, too deliberate. I could feel its presence, as if the fog itself had come alive, swirling in time with my heartbeat. Ava. The voice, low and distorted, called after me, growing louder, closer, as if the fog was pulling it toward me, forcing it to wrap around my mind like a noose. I couldn't escape it, no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many twists and turns I made through the trees. The figure was always just behind me, lurking in the shadows, never letting me get far enough to outrun it. I burst into a clearing, gasping for air. The fog hung so thick in the air that I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. The trees around me seemed to stretch upward infinitely, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The clearing was eerily silent now, the only sound the frantic thudding of my heart in my chest. But that silence was a lie. It was a silence that pressed against my skull, that whispered secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I turned in a circle, searching for any sign of escape, but the fog closed in tighter, thicker, until I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The only thing that remained was that same, familiar voice. Ava, we've been waiting for you. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just the voice now, it was everywhere. The sound, the words, the whispers, they were seeping into my very skin. The air seemed to vibrate with them, their presence too loud, too close. The fog swirled faster, moving like an entity of its own, drawing me in. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, keeping me trapped here, frozen in the heart of the clearing. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape emerging from the mist. But then, it took form. The figure stepped out of the fog, slowly, deliberately. It was taller than any man I had ever seen, its body bent at strange angles, like a broken marionette. The face, if you could call it a face, was pale and featureless, smooth as though it had never been made. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an endless white expanse where features should have been. But the thing that made my stomach lurch wasn't its appearance. It was the feeling of familiarity, the overwhelming sense that I had seen this thing before. Seen it, or known it. Its long, slender arms reached toward me, its fingers outstretched like claws, dragging through the fog as though it was weaving the very air around it. The sound of its movement was wrong. Too smooth, too fluid, as if it didn't belong to this world. I took a step back, heart hammering. "Who are you?" I gasped, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but it didn't need to. The air around me grew heavier, pressing in, suffocating. A sense of dread unlike anything I had ever known settled in my bones. I felt it then. The deep, unshakable truth that I had been brought here for a reason. I had been chosen. I didn't know how I knew, but I felt it in every fiber of my being. This thing in the fog, was connected to me. To everything. To my past. The figure took another step forward, its motion impossibly smooth. Its fingers brushed the air in front of me, and the world seemed to tremble. "Ava." The voice, that same whisper, filled my mind. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was inside me, in my thoughts, in my memories. "You came here looking for peace," the voice murmured. "But there is no peace for you. You were never meant to leave." I stumbled back, shaking my head, trying to make sense of the words. But they didn't make sense. They couldn't. Suddenly, a flash of memory hit me, a memory I hadn't thought of in years, buried so deep that I had almost forgotten. It was of a face. My mother's face. Pale and lifeless, eyes wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. And then I remembered the house that had once been ours before it had burned down. The fire, the screams, the curse. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the ground beneath me give way. The figure, that terrible, faceless thing, was part of it. It had been waiting for me, waiting for all of us. And now, it was here, in the fog, in the darkness, ready to take me back. My feet scrambled for purchase on the wet earth, but there was no escape. The clearing seemed to close in, the fog thickening, the figure looming over me like a predator about to strike. My vision blurred as the whispers filled my head, drowning out everything else. "Ava," it called again, the sound rising to a cacophony. "You never escaped. You never left." I screamed, but it was swallowed by the fog, the figure's presence suffocating everything. My body jerked, my thoughts splintering into 1,000 pieces. And then, it was quiet. Silent. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dark. The fog was gone. The trees were gone. Everything was gone. I was standing in a dark room. The same room I had left behind. My old bedroom, the one I hadn't seen in years. But it wasn't real. I knew that. The walls were peeling, the window cracked. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering. The air was thick with dust, the remnants of something long forgotten. I heard the sound of breathing behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. "Ava," the voice whispered again, this time soft, almost tender. I knew what would happen next. I would turn around, and I would see it. The thing that had followed me. The thing that had waited for me. But I had already known it wasn't over. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, as though I were choking on it. My head spun, dizziness creeping in from the edges of my vision. The dark room, my old bedroom, felt wrong, like an echo of something that was never truly real. The walls seemed to pulse with the slow rhythm of a heartbeat, or was that mine? The flickering light above me cast long, unnatural shadows across the room, stretching and pulling in ways that made no sense. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The whispers, the soft, honeyed voice, still echoed in my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. Ava, it murmured again. It was closer now, too close. We've been waiting. I swallowed, my throat dry as dust. I could hear it breathing behind me, slow and steady, each inhale too deep, too unnatural. It's not real, I told myself. This isn't real. But the trembling in my hands told a different story. The air felt so thick, so oppressive, that every inch of my body screamed to escape. I had to leave. I had to. But as I took a step toward the door, I felt it. A pressure on my chest, a weight that wasn't there before. My limbs felt like they were moving through water, slow and heavy, as though the very room was pushing back against me. Ava, the voice whispered, now just a breath in my ear. You can't leave. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out all sound except the steady, rhythmic breathing behind me. Something had changed. Something was different. My body felt distant, detached from the fear that gripped me. It was as though I was no longer fully here. I wasn't in this room, not truly. I was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Somewhere cold. The room seemed to bend around me, the walls warping and stretching, the shadows dancing like figures in a twisted play. My mind struggled to keep up with what I was seeing. The doorway, the bed, the window, they all blurred, and the only thing that stayed clear was the voice. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an invitation. Ava, it said, sweet and smooth, like a lullaby sung by a distant memory. Come closer. We've been waiting. I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the bed. The sheets were tattered, stained with something I didn't want to know. The mattress sagged in the middle, the fabric stretched thin, the smell of rot hanging in the air like something alive. Why are you doing this? I screamed, but no sound came out. My mouth opened, my throat burned, but there was only silence. I stepped closer to the bed, my feet moving as though they weren't mine. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to go back to that place where the fire had started, where it had all begun. The room grew colder. The light flickered once, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. The whispers stopped, but the absence of sound was worse. It pressed against me, suffocating. I could hear the thudding of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in the silence. Then, slowly, a single word pierced the void. Ava. It was softer now, a breath, a whisper, almost playful. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But it was no use. The voice wasn't in my ears anymore, it was in my mind, in my soul. A tremor ran through me, deep in my bones. And then I saw it. A figure, faint at first, emerging from the corners of my vision, growing clearer, more distinct. It was there, no longer in the fog, but in the darkness of the room, standing at the foot of the bed. That same shape, that same form. The tall, bent figure with its faceless head, its long, crooked arms reaching out toward me. I didn't move. Ava, it said again, its voice now a soft, distorted hum, like it was singing. It's time. Time for what? The question burned through my mind, but I already knew the answer. It wasn't time to leave. It was time to give in. The figure raised one arm, the long, skeletal fingers curling toward me. I couldn't stop it. My body didn't belong to me anymore. It was as though the room had become my body, the air my blood, and the figure my soul. The whispers began again, this time all around me, flooding my senses. There were so many of them now, each one indistinguishable from the other, their words blending into a low, hypnotic chant. I tried to fight it. I tried to scream, to move, to escape, but my body betrayed me. It locked in place, trembling, unable to act. I heard the creak of floorboards. The faintest sound of a door opening. The door, my only way out. But no, the voice. It didn't let me. The pressure in the room intensified, and a burning sensation flooded my chest. You can't leave, the voice hissed. You're already here. You were always here. And then, everything stopped. I opened my eyes. The room was silent again. The figure was gone. The fog was gone. The trees, the clearing, the darkness, they were gone. I stood in the middle of my living room again, the fire crackling in the fireplace, the soft hum of the house around me. Had it all been a dream? I turned to the door, my pulse racing. The knocking was faint, but unmistakable. 3 knocks, followed by silence. It's not over, I realized, my heart sinking. The whispers were still there, lingering in my thoughts, creeping into the corners of my mind. The horror had never left. It had only been waiting for me to come back. The whispers began again. Ava. I froze. The door to my apartment creaked open. 3 knocks. The air was thick again, heavy with the same pressure that had consumed me in that cursed room. The whispers were there, too, swirling in the corners of my mind, soft and maddening. Ava. I turned toward the door, the hairs on my neck standing on end. My heart hammered in my chest as the door opened wider, revealing only darkness beyond. The light from the hallway flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. I couldn't bring myself to move closer. I just stood there, frozen in place, eyes locked on the doorway. My thoughts raced, each one a desperate attempt to make sense of it all. Was this real? Was I still dreaming? But deep down, I knew. I knew this was real. It was the same feeling, the same dread, that had gnawed at me ever since I had stepped foot in that cursed forest. The thing had followed me. The thing had always followed me. Ava. The voice was clearer now, a familiar whisper that carried a strange, comforting warmth. It was the same voice I had heard in that house, in the woods, in the fog. But now, it wasn't just in my mind. It was here, in the apartment, in the room with me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't think anymore. The door was open wide now, the darkness beyond beckoning, inviting me in. I knew what was waiting there, but I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. My feet moved as though they were not my own, carrying me forward with a slow, inevitable pull. It's not real, I told myself again. It can't be. But with each step, the air grew colder, heavier. The whispers grew louder, until they drowned out everything else. There was no escape, no turning back. I had walked into this nightmare, and now it was pulling me deeper. The apartment was gone. The walls began to blur, the furniture warping and stretching like melted wax. I was back in the same room where it had all started. The fire, the screams, the figure. It was standing in the corner again, that twisted, faceless thing. Its long, skeletal arms reached out toward me, its empty gaze locking onto mine, its presence pulling me into the dark. "You've come back," the voice said, only this time, it was not just a whisper. It was a promise. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. The figure stepped forward, its feet dragging along the floor, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the room. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, merging into a single, unified voice that rattled the very core of my being. "Ava," it called again. "You never left." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body was frozen, my legs refusing to obey, my throat locked tight with terror. The figure was inches from me now. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, could feel the darkness closing in around me. The room shifted again, and I was back in that clearing, the fog swirling around me. The trees loomed, the air thick with an unnatural weight. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, I'm not." But the words didn't matter. They never had. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of electricity through me. My skin burned, my heart raced, and I could feel myself slipping away. "Ava," it whispered one last time, its voice now soft, tender, as if it were comforting me. "You are ours." Suddenly, everything went dark. The fog, the whispers, the figure, they were all gone, and I was alone in the void. But even in the darkness, I knew the truth. The figure wasn't gone. It was with me now. It had always been with me. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. I sat up in bed, my chest heaving, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to me. The room was dark, still, silent, but it felt wrong. The air was too heavy, too thick. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as though they were alive. I glanced around, heart pounding. The knocking hadn't stopped. 3 knocks. They came from the door. The sound was the same as before, slow and deliberate, but now it was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that filled the room. The same voice, the same feeling of suffocating dread. "It's not real. It can't be." But as I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, I knew it was. The whispers were louder now, too close, too insistent. "Ava," they breathed. I stumbled toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was open the door. When I did, I saw it. The figure stood there, its faceless gaze locked onto mine. It had followed me here. To this apartment. To this place. "You came back," it whispered, its voice low and final. "You never left." The door slammed shut behind me. In this resolution, Ava's fate is sealed. She wakes up, but the nightmare follows her, pulling her back into the darkness. The twist at the end reveals that no matter where she goes, the entity is with her, and the horrors she experienced are never truly over. The whispers, the figure, it was always part of her past, and now, it will always be a part of her future. This leaves the listener with a chilling uncertainty, questioning whether Ava will ever escape or if the horrors will continue to haunt her forever.